Right, let's be completely honest here for a second. We all watch these high-production outdoor survival shows or scroll through social media clips thinking a massive, roaring fire and a heavy wool blanket are all it takes to survive a night in the deep bush, don't we? Yeah, don't worry, I used to be the exact same way. You look at those old-school paintings of frontier life and you think, man, those guys were absolute units, they had it completely figured out. Until you stumble across some old frontier archives and old company logbooks that leave you completely floored. Hold up, let me adjust my mic here for a second because when I first read these accounts, I thought the records were completely out to lunch. I had to read them twice just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. The real killer out there in the dead of winter, when the thermometer drops down to -40 or -50 in places like the Yukon or northern Ontario, wasn't the sudden blizzard or a pack of timber wolves. It was something way more sneaky, way more insidious. It was a single, fundamental mistake made right at the campfire, the very thing that was supposed to keep them alive. We are talking about experienced, tough-as-nails Canadian trappers who survived years in the backcountry, only to be found by their partners days later, completely frozen in their sleep inside a fully intact shelter. No storm had hit them. They had plenty of dry firewood left over. They had top-tier fur robes. But they made one crucial logical-sounding error with how they set up their campfire that night, and it turned their entire sleeping area into a literal death trap. Let's break down exactly what went wrong, because honestly, it's an absolute gong show how easily physics can turn against you when you're exhausted in the bush. The unfiltered list. The fatal campfire blunder. The old folklore always sells you the dream that these tough frontier boys knew every single trick in the book, right? But when you actually look at the journal records from the late 1800s and early 1900s, man, it's just heartbreakingly clueless in some spots. You see these recurring reports where a pair of trappers set up a temporary camp in the middle of the boreal forest. They're exhausted after trekking through deep powder for 8 hours straight, checking their line, hauling heavy gear. They're cold to the bone, and their brains are running on fumes. So, what's the first instinct when you finally stop for the night? You want heat, and you want it fast. Here is exactly how the disaster unfolds, step by step, and it all starts with the way they constructed their shelter and fire. 1. The enclosed shelter mistake. To keep the biting wind off their faces, they'd construct a tight, low-profile lean-to or set up a heavy canvas wall tent. They'd seal it up as best as they could with pine boughs, snow, and tarps to trap every single bit of warmth. On paper, that makes perfect sense. You want to keep the cold air out and the warm air in. Giving your head a shake now, you can probably see where this is going, but to an exhausted trapper in 1895, it seemed like brilliant engineering. 2. Building the fire on the wrong foundation. Because they were completely wiped out from the trail, they didn't want to spend 2 or 3 hours digging through 4 feet of packed snow and frozen muskeg just to reach the bare earth or solid bedrock. Instead, they just stomped down the snow inside or right at the mouth of their enclosed shelter, lay down a few green logs as a base, what we call a fire hearth, and build a massive, blazing campfire right on top of it. They figured the green logs would insulate the fire from the snow underneath. 3. The downward radiation trap. Here's where the physics of a campfire completely hoops you if you aren't careful. A fire doesn't just radiate heat up and out into the room. It radiates an immense amount of thermal energy straight down. Those green base logs, they buy you an hour, maybe two at most. Pretty soon, the intense heat penetrates right through them and starts rapidly melting the deep, frozen ground and packed snow directly beneath the fire. 4. The steam choke phenomenon. As that snow and frozen muskeg turn into a boiling puddle under the coals, a massive amount of heavy, supersaturated, humid steam begins to rise. Because the shelter is tightly enclosed to keep the wind out, that moisture has absolutely nowhere to escape. It fills the entire space. As the trappers are sleeping, this thick, humid vapor settles over everything. It gets drawn straight into their heavy wool blankets and their beaver or caribou fur robes. Now, if you know anything about winter survival, you know that moisture is your absolute worst enemy. Water conducts heat away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than still air. The moment those insulating layers get damp from the rising steam, their R value, their ability to trap body heat, drops straight to 0. 5. The suffocation and sinking fire. But it gets worse. As the campfire keeps melting the snow underneath itself, it begins to sink into a deep, wet pit of its own making. The fire is now literally drowning from the bottom up in its own meltwater. It stops burning clean. The bright, hot flames die down, and the fire begins to smolder violently, producing a massive amount of thick soot and, more importantly, carbon monoxide. In a tightly sealed shelter, with the air already heavy and thick from steam, that carbon monoxide builds up fast. The trappers are already asleep, completely exhausted. Carbon monoxide is odorless and tasteless. It doesn't wake you up. Instead, it just gently pushes you into a deeper, permanent sleep by blocking your body's ability to carry oxygen. 6. The flash freeze. Eventually, the drowning fire goes completely out. The heat source is totally gone. Within an hour, the ambient temperature inside that small shelter instantly plunges right back down to match the brutal outdoor environment. -40 degrees. Think about that setup. You have two trappers who are completely unconscious due to mild carbon monoxide poisoning and extreme physical exhaustion. Their clothing is damp, and their heavy blankets are completely soaked through with condensed steam. The moment the fire dies, all that moisture instantly freezes solid. The wet wool blankets turn into rigid sheets of ice, completely stripping away any remaining body heat through conduction. They didn't freeze because a blizzard ripped their shelter away. They froze because their own campfire created a humid, toxic microclimate that systematically destroyed their insulation from the inside out. It's an absolute nightmare scenario. Historical archive note: found the Miller brothers in their camp near the temporary lean-to by the river fork. The shelter was standing and a cord of good dry wood remained untouched. The fire had sunk 3 feet into the muskeg and turned to ice. Both men lay under frozen blankets as if asleep, with no mark of distress upon them. Their gear was heavy with frost. Northwest Mounted Police Patrol Journal, 1902. Let's do a quick reality check right here, because I want to see where your heads are at. If you have ever done any winter crownland camping, or if you honestly figure you would last a single night out in a winter bush environment like the Yukon without modern gear, do me a massive favor. Drop a "right on" or a "hooped" in the comments section right now, just so I know who is actually keeping up with the physics of this survival stuff and who is just here for the crazy stories. Seriously, be honest. Because looking at these old journals, it's clear that even the toughest historical figures could get totally turned around by a lack of basic thermodynamic understanding. It makes you realize that survival isn't just about grit and muscle. It's about knowing how heat and water actually interact when the stakes are life and death. Alright, look, enough of the grim details. Let's talk about the guys who actually got it right, because people did live out there for thousands of years without turning into human popsicles. The indigenous guides, the Cree, the Dean, the Innu, and the seasoned line trappers who actually bothered to learn from them, had a completely different approach to winter camp management. They understood the physics of cold weather sleeping perfectly, and their methods were the exact opposite of the mistakes we just talked about. First off, they never, ever built a fire directly on top of deep snow or frozen organic muskeg if they could avoid it. If they were making a serious camp, they took the time to use snowshoes as shovels and dug all the way down until they hit the actual bedrock or mineral soil. If the snow was just too deep to dig out completely, they didn't build the fire inside their shelter at all. Instead, they utilized an open-faced shelter system, usually a simple lean-to angled perfectly to block the prevailing wind, but completely open on the front side facing the fire. And here is the real secret sauce: the reflector wall. Instead of putting the fire inside with them where the smoke, steam, and gases could trap them, they built a massive wall of green logs or stacked rocks behind the campfire, entirely outside the shelter. The fire was built on the cleared ground between the open shelter and this reflector wall. This setup utilizes the beauty of pure radiant heat. Radiant heat waves travel through the air without heating the air itself. They only heat the solid objects they hit, like your body and your blankets. The reflector wall bounced all that gorgeous, dry, radiant heat directly into the open face of the lean-to. Because the shelter was open on one side, any steam created by the fire or any moisture from the melting snow nearby drifted harmlessly away into the atmosphere. The air inside the sleeping area stayed completely dry. No carbon monoxide could ever build up because the ventilation was literally infinite. But what about the floor? They didn't just sleep on the cold ground. They would harvest hundreds of small, springy branches from balsam fir or spruce trees, what old-timers called spruce tags. They didn't just throw them on the ground randomly. They thatched them carefully, sticking the broken ends down into the snow at an angle so the soft, feathery needles faced up. They would build this bough bed up until it was at least a foot thick. This created a massive, dead air space insulation barrier between their bodies and the frozen earth. The boughs trapped their body heat from escaping downward via conduction, while the dry campfire outside bathed them in radiant heat from the front. Even if the fire went completely out in the middle of the night, the trappers remained entirely dry. They might wake up chilly, but because their wool and furs were bone-dry, they could just roll over, throw another log on the coals, and keep right on sleeping safely. So, what have we learned from the folks who didn't make it, and the ones who lived to tell the tale? It all comes down to respecting the elements and not letting your exhaustion dictate your camp setup. The moment you try to shortcut the wilderness by sealing yourself up with a quick fire on an unstable base, you are playing a highly dangerous game with thermodynamics. Next time you're out in the winter woods, even if it's just a fun weekend trip on Crown Land, remember the Miller brothers and the hidden traps of the boreal forest. Clear your ground, vent your space, keep your insulation dry, and don't let your campfire become the very thing that finishes you off. Stay safe out there, buds, look after each other, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive investigation. Right on.